Good morning. How are we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit. Welcome back to another episode of the Red Ship Burger Podcast. Joined today by Chris Warren. Chris, how you doing today?
I'm doing good. How are you doing, James?
Excellent. Today I want to talk about exploitative play. And essentially, we've been talking about GTO a ton over the last few weeks and even kind of couple few months. But exploitative play is kind of the other side of that coin. And I think it's really important that we have a conversation about exploitative play and kind of help people understand when it's good, when it's maybe not so good, when it's the proper justification, and kind of just chit chat about that overall. So why don't you kick us off kind of your overall thoughts on GTO versus exploitative play and what you're kind of thinking about when comparing these two kind of approaches?
Yeah, interesting. How I compare them in my head. I would say for me, this really popped up because of the Discord. You know, if you haven't joined the Discord, we have active discussions. People come in, post their hands, post ideas, and I think those are some of the best discussions sometimes. Or when a hand brings up an idea. And really, what I've noticed is that a lot of people will say, come in, make a play, like a pre-flop call or checking back on a flop, etc. And they'll say, well, I was just thinking exploitatively. It's actually less flop C bets and a lot of like pre-flop decisions. And, you know, when I break it down, like the logic behind this being an exploitative play doesn't really hold for me a lot of times because I'm looking at it, I'm like, well, what's the assumption that makes this better? And so, you know, we'll get some HUD stats or player tendencies, and usually it's justifying a call or not three betting or something like that. And, you know, for me, whenever I'm like thinking exploitatively, there's actually a very strong assumption and logic data framework that's kind of going into that. And I think a lot of people are just not using that. And basically they're saying, well, I know I'm not playing the GTO line, so I'm going to guess, or I'm going to play how I want to play, or maybe I feel like this mitigates risk and things like that. And so, yeah, I'd really like to discuss, you know, what is an exploitative play and how do we actually find our assumptions and outline all that.
Sure. So I think the way that I've always kind of defined exploitative play is identifying a strategic kink in your opponent's strategy and then exploiting them by taking advantage of that strategic issue in their game. So the easiest example that I always think of is someone who folds too often against bets. Right, so what is the easy way that we can exploit them? We just bluff everything with impunity because they're going to fold too often, and as such, we just print money. We can bluff literally with the worst holdings in our range and still make money in that situation. No problem whatsoever, kind of super easy. If you go to the opposite side of the spectrum and think about someone who just never folds, right, really, really fishy, well, one of the ways you can exploit them is just kind of shaving out a bunch of the bluffs out of your betting range and just bet at them with hands that they're going to pay you off with, since they're going to do that at such a large chunk. So it's just looking at the things that they're doing wrong, and oftentimes things that they're doing too much of, be it folding too much or continuing too much, whatever, and exploiting them that way. So that's kind of like the 10,000 foot view that I think of. Is there anything you'd add to that or subtract from that?
Yeah, I would say one of the most important category of exploits are exploits that create complexity for your opponent. And a good example of this is sort of the recent trend towards the small c-bet. And the reason why the small c-bet is so effective is because we're forcing our opponents to play a wide range of hands by reducing the size of our bet. And we're forcing them to basically balance a complicated scenario. And that's a very persistent way to exploit people, because even if there is a strictly effective GTO response, it's difficult. You would have to like spend a lot of time learning how to do that, and most people they just won't.
Fair. So my approach is kind of very, very simplistic, or at least sort of simplistic, in the sense of I'm looking for people that do something too much and then figuring out a way to exploit them. Whereas even your focus is still kind of a building your strategy around, I'm not exactly sure how to word it, but like mine is very like look at them focused and then attack, and yours is kind of seems to be make sure that your strategy has some inherent or adds extra complication to their strategy. So
yeah, I think I lean defensively.
Okay.
where I'm actually not looking to primarily, in many situations, and there's situations where I will, but in many situations, I'm just looking to balance out my own play. Oh, I think, this sort of sizing in these scenarios is correct. This works. Therefore, I'm going to build my entire range balanced so that even if someone knew what I was doing, or if what I'm doing becomes obvious, I will be protected and they will still be presented with the reasons why I chose this, whether it creates complicated scenarios for them or whatever. Because, yeah, at the end of the day, one thing we have to be aware of with GTO play, and this is one of the benefits of thinking exploitatively, is that we don't really know what the right bet sizes are technically. There are probably solves out there that do a good job at finding the best bet size, but every flop, is essentially a different scenario. Every turn is a different scenario. It's just too much, really, for us to memorize and use in the game in the moment. We're using kind of heuristics at the moment to guess on bet sizes. So even if I just pick a bet size, it's not technically like a protected bet size, no matter what I do. So I am using some sort of, I would say, probably exploitative logic. But within that, I want my range to be balanced unless I have very, very good reasons to deviate.
So, talk about some of the times when you would deviate. Like, what would make you go into. Because essentially, the deviation from a GTO approach is getting you into exploitative approaches.
Yes.
And obviously, you can go different layers of that. You can go like extremely exploitative, and you can go just kind of like slightly. Talk a little bit about when you start deviating from GTO. What are you looking for in those scenarios? Like, what really makes you jump and say, I want to deviate in this spot?
So I think we really have to think about like three main scenarios for people who are just sort of your standard good players, right? Number one is going to just be that wide three bet. This is something that we see like good players do all the time. And the reason for it is that just almost no one likes four bet bluffing. It's uncomfortable. It's hard to do like balance and get the right frequencies because you're not using, usually you're starting to move out of the do 100% actions with each hand type of thing if you want to do it kind of accurately. And yeah, wide three bets are just, they're just great. There's so much good about them. It puts pressure on people who are open raising too much and playing too many hands, which is, almost everyone. It just plays on all the tendencies that humans have playing a game of poker that a computer wouldn't have, and puts us in the situation where we don't actually have to defend it. The strategy, implementing the strategy, is incredibly simple, right? Just pick a frequency of hands to three bet and then just do it. And yeah, I mean, the only reason people don't do this, I think, is that they're uncomfortable with the size of the pots with the weak hands. But that's basically the only thing you have to fix to get into that strategy. The next one I would say is the small preflop raises and the small c-bet sizes. And like I said, basically the reasons why this is good is it forces people to play a lot of hands and play them in a complicated manner. Simple as that.
Yep.
Not too much. And then the last situation I would say, and this is probably the most difficult one, but is going into board textures and things like that and really understanding how would people kind of continue with their ranges in these scenarios. And that can be a population analysis type thing. That can be a large population. And it can just be you learned your game and this is how people think. Or this can be, we've studied, the broad databases, millions of hands, and we figured out that people will react in these certain ways on these type of textures. So we leverage those two pieces of data and we try and come up with lines that we're saying, actually, when you get into a river scenario, it can be very difficult to know where your GTO balance is, even for someone who's very studied, just because it's such a specific scenario. And, we lean on the heuristic of like, try and have a few bluffs, try not to be over bluffing, make sure, you have value bets that like the sizing you picked. We're dealing with some pretty rough estimations. So exploitative logic has a lot of value here. Like we talked about a board last week that was ace king nine on the flop, where we had called a pre-flop raise. And, this is a very specific texture because it's like all of a sudden we know we can't have a lot of the nutted hands. And so we were analyzing that. And so those very specific textures can create scenarios where you're like, it's a lot more probable that my opponent would say run a bluff in this scenario because they know my range is limited in terms of strength. And so we can make some, some reads and some estimations based on like textures, I would say, and how we think people will react to textures. And a lot of times, again, same as GTO, we know in GTO we'd be leaning on some softer assumptions that we don't have as clear-cut data on. A lot of times that's happening here, and we're actually just saying, okay, there's two options here. None of them feel like clear-cut. I need to do some analysis to just kind of figure out which direction I want to lean in. And it really is that. It's an estimation. It's a useful way to help us solve ambiguous situations in poker, I would say.
Fair. I think one of the issues when someone hears the player population analysis thing is they start thinking about, okay, who are the players in my game? What kind of strategic mistakes do they tend to make? Where do they tend to play well? Where do they tend to play really poorly? And especially when you're playing like smaller games, live 1-2, or you're playing, below 25 NL online, like most of your game is pretty darn soft, right? You might find a couple of aggro players, but more often than not, you're talking about a lot of passivity. You're talking about more fishy tendencies, more continuance than should be, not nearly enough raising really anywhere. And I think they can start telling themselves a story pretty quickly. And one of the issues I think with player pool analysis is that they forget that they're playing against a single person sometimes. And right, just because you play in a fairly passive game doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to have that one aggro dude. And you're going to have to adjust your strategy slightly for that. And I think it's just very easy to get lost and make the incorrect adjustments in a single instance when you actually have information that would force you to deviate. So the deviation isn't just deviating from the GTO approach. The deviation is when do I deviate exploitatively from the player pool analysis versus the exact situation I find myself in. And I think that goes overlooked more often than it should.
I agree. Yeah, it's, they aren't used to someone over bluffing at 10 to limit, right? Which makes sense, but it doesn't mean that 10 to limit players aren't capable of over bluffing in spots, right? That definitely happens. And as I was outlining with specific scenarios, even small stakes players will recognize, oh, this is a good situation that puts a lot of pressure on my opponent. They have a weak range here, they're capped. People can pick up on those things. It's not it's definitely not impossible that you get in scenarios where your opponents are over bluffing. And in fact, yeah, I just know when I was testing our GTO ranges at 100 in the limit, like I was catching crazy bluffs. I was just like, yeah, I'm only bluff catching here, like call. And it would happen again and again.
Yeah. But therein lies, I think, one of the issues is people they use exploitative as an excuse or a justification for playing nitty. And I think that's oftentimes what it is. Because you mentioned the 3-betting is one of like the major 3 scenarios. And I think a lot of players will look for spots where they could, maybe it's a 3-bet, maybe it's a call, but I'm going to call here and say it's exploitative. Yeah, I mean, we saw that in the comments from the video that went out last week. And someone was trying to justify, like we said, hey, we as the preflop caller would never have aces in our range. And he's like, well, we could because this spot. And I'm like, okay, let's just say the aces were a profitable call there. And by the way, they are. Like, as long as you're not folding aces preflop, yes, of course it's profitable. But just because something is profitable doesn't mean it's optimal and doesn't mean it's better. And it is far better to 3-bet than it is to flat aces in that scenario. In just like, I don't know, pretty much all scenarios. So talk a little bit, if you can, about why this becomes kind of a crutch. Because it seems to me to be a justification crutch and I don't want to have to put in more money, so I'm just going to say I call exploitatively, or I check back this turn exploitatively. Well, maybe, but I don't know. Any thoughts?
Yeah, it's definitely, the problem is, I would even say it's not even the fact that it's nitty, it's a weak play, right? And that weak plays are the way to burn yourself in poker the absolute fastest. So that's like whenever we start hearing about someone flatting aces and things like that, it's like the thing I always say is just you have to be really sure this is a good play.
Yep.
And usually we see the players doing this who are newer players. And so that level of certainty is something that I wouldn't anticipate from a newer player. And so yeah, it's just you're just trying to justify what you want to do. And you have to be so careful about that in poker because the tendency of everyone in poker, 99.9% of people play too many hands. They call too much and they don't play aggressively enough. That's like, you know, there's the one Isildur for every, 1,000 of you who just wants to call too much, right? And it's it's devastating to your win rate. Like you really just anything that's in your game like that is a potential huge leak. For the aces, like if we just start exploring what is the logic on that, it's like okay, we're flatting aces, so we trap someone and they squeeze us, right? Well, are people actually squeezing a lot? Like how many games do you play in where it's like, oh, I'm really worried about the blind squeezing?
Right.
It happens. Like I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's like, oh, my lifetime, how many situations? It's less than 5% of the time I've been like in a hand and be like, oh, this is these people in the blinds are going to come after me, right?
And to be clear, when that's the case, it's so damn obvious. Like, there's
Yeah.
not a question about it. It's just like, okay, yeah, I know that the blinds are like super, super squeeze happy. And like, you can see them grabbing for squeeze chips and three bet chips like immediately. It's so obvious. And if it's not obvious, that's your telltale. Like, don't fool yourself. Don't outthink it. Because that's kind of what's going to happen when you start trying to get all tricky with these little trippy, trappy flops or, trap calls. Just put yourself in absolute crap by doing so.
Well, we have to break out our assumptions. It's like, well, what makes a three bet better versus what makes a call better, right? The only thing that makes a call better is just like crazy squeezing, right? Which is like it's crazy. It has to be crazy. Therefore, it has to be rare. We also have to remember when you three bet, sometimes they're gonna cold call your three bet and cold four bet you and things like that. And aggressive players who are looking for squeezes are probably also looking for like ways to cold four bet or not giving up to a three bet, playing too loose against the three bet, etc. And those seem like, oh well, that's such a small percentage. Like how often do you see someone? It's like yeah, but like how often are you three betting, right? And if you haven't three bet a lot, like you have to understand that those scenarios come up quite a bit, especially in live games. The cold calling of the three bets with hands like tens or ace ten suited, it happens all the time, and that makes you a huge amount of money when you three bet your aces and someone just cold calls, and then maybe the other person shoves on you sometimes and you just got all this dead money in the pot. It's like there's so many incredible scenarios that come up with three betting that you wouldn't just like anticipate, and those aren't being included in your analysis when you're saying, oh, I think they squeeze a lot, and you're even going against the natural tendency, which is like, oh, like are people really that aggressive? And we say our general tendency is that they're not. So yeah, I mean it's so common for people to just kind of justify making the play that they want to play. They want to call with aces because it's really fun to minimize how much you lose when there's like a ton of action on the flop, and you know get like huge stacks in or whatever when someone comes after it and your hand is disguised. Like I get it, it's fun. Like there's fun value there, but from an EV perspective, we really when we're making exploitative plays, we have to look at our assumptions, go with the highest EV.
Yeah. And while this isn't necessarily a point on exploitative versus GTO approaches, I think some players will say, well, I've three bet my aces before and everyone folded.
Yeah.
Cool. That's fine. That definitely happens, and it's going to happen some percentage of the time. Doesn't inherently mean you made a mistake, though, which I think is incredibly important to remember. And then also, if people are folding to your three bets when you have the monster hands, why do
Yes.
you think that they're never going to fold when you three bet with your not so monster hands? So like it's almost like honestly that part just like gets completely forgotten because they're so focused on, oh, I didn't maximize with my big hand. Well, that also can give you other pieces of information. So don't get so caught up in like, oh, my aces didn't get paid off when, I don't know, maybe you can start turning ace 10 off into easy three bets here and lots of other things.
Well, and that's almost the thing is that actually what you should be doing is you should be looking for a lot of wide three bets. Like if you think your opponents if you think they are the type of player that might fold because you three bet, you can go nuts with that. I
Yep.
mean, you can really create a lot of profitability taking advantage of that. And so if you feel like your range is predictable, like this was I think almost like the main dynamic. This is one of the main things we thought about, I think, in 2005 to 2010. It was just like, can I wide three bet? Can I wide three bet? And you're just always asking yourself that question. And so what comes up naturally when you're doing that is that like it becomes very good to three bet your aces because your opponents know that like, okay, they've been coming after us in this three betting spot. And now when you have aces, it's so powerful because it's the backing strength behind that strategy. If you were to flat your aces when you're three betting wide a lot, it's like all of a sudden, I mean, I probably wouldn't do it multiple times in a row, but if you did, your strategy is now incredibly exploitable because your opponents know you don't have the most important hand in your range.
Yeah.
And yeah, just really make sure you go through the assumptions and the possible scenarios that play out. When people make a light call pre-flop, one of the things I hear the most is, well, there's bad players in the blinds. So, okay, I get that. That's a very common justification. I even hear that at high stakes a lot of times. Makes sense. You don't want to shut out the bad player from the pot. The thing I worry about is when you're playing a hand that you could three bet and then you flat call. To me, that's no good. That you don't do that because there's the tag open raised and the bad players in the blinds. It goes back to the same assumptions. I just say to myself, okay, well, if I'm going to three bet with my normal strong three bet range, all that makes money. We just know that makes money. It's fine against the tag. If the like loose bad player decides to cold call the three bet, that's more likely. My standard aggressive tight three bet range is great. I want everyone playing against that. Like I want to take my guaranteed profit there. If I were to start flat calling too many of those hands, I'm immediately giving away money that I now have to compensate for by this player playing really badly. And I think people really overestimate how badly a bad player can play post flop sometimes. Imagine a multi-way pot, with some action. Like, are they stacking off second pair? Or are they just like calling down ace high? And like, people don't do that in 2020. Even really bad player. If we're talking about someone who's like drunk and rich and just like literally hurling away money, like, okay, like now maybe the logic plays, but you have to deal with an extreme scenario for their weakness to really justify some of these plays. Yeah, how do you think about that scenario?
It's kind of the same way, and it is definitely a common justification. There's weak players behind me, there's fish in the blinds, and as such, I can call way, way wider here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're right. It's definitely more potent to have this conversation from the point of view of having a default three bet hand. I think a lot of players will justify this for getting involved with wider calls. So like, the 9-6 suited all of a sudden come out and queen 9 offsuit all of a sudden starts getting thrown in the call range, and justification is implied odds, implied odds, implied odds.
Yeah.
But I mean, are you really crushing in that multi-way pot? Because that's the thing, you're setting yourself up for the multi-way pot. So you have to be so damn certain that you're that much stronger in that spot, that
Yes.
you're not going to make mistakes. And I think people just get so focused on the singular action. Do I call or do I not call? Versus, am I going to make some real blunders after this? Because it only takes a couple of blunders in your overall branching post flop before all of a sudden that pre flop call just becomes absolutely no bueno.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's I would say there is of course validity to the fact that your opponent is adding some profitability to a call, right? They're adding odds. That does exist. However, I think the assumption on how poorly people play post flop is massively overestimated. What we're actually looking for when we're looking for weakness post flop, it is good if someone stacks off light, like, but it's very hard to quantify, and you have to understand that scenario where they have a hand and you have a hand, and their hand is outside of like the hands that they should be continuing with, but they happen to be continuing with here a bit too lightly. When you actually break that down, it's actually quite rare. It's like, yes, there is value there, but is it like adding a big blind on average to every hand that you call? Almost no chance. They have to be really, really, really spewy. Like stack off second pair for a stack spewy type of thing.
Regularly.
Yes.
Regularly. Not it happens once in a blue moon. And that's I think where people get caught. Like, you know, I've seen this person dump off major in like a pot. Okay, how many times do you see them do that overall though? Because just because it happens once doesn't mean you're getting the same privilege.
Yeah, it's like there was the three flush on the turn, and then they had a weak second pair with the, it's like those type of scenarios where it's like, oh, they actually like, there was some reason, like there was some rationale pushing them in that direction. They're not just like doing it for no reason, or they thought the person was weak and they're making a weird play. Like those are actually not that, they don't add that much to any type of implied odds. And the thing that you're actually looking for is just folds. Folds are huge profit, right? So if you go into a pot and you're in position and you know your opponents will just kind of check, give up, and you can just put out a tiny little bet and everyone's going to, play super straightforward and not come after you. Okay, like you could probably play some hands in that situation. But how many poker games play like that? And can you invite me if you know where it is? Like, I would like
Seriously.
to join.
Yes. Yeah, and you said something there, and now I'm totally breaking on what it was, but I loved it.
Oh, we're
Damn
looking
it.
at weakness. We're looking at folds when we call wide.
We really are, which brings more validity to your why we want to look at three betting so aggressively, because that's where the real value is. And again, just because you can call something more profitably preflop doesn't mean you couldn't three bet it more profitably preflop. And also the overlap. Okay, that's what it was. The implied odds on I'm going to call and get paid off with this, marginal preflop call. Let's just call it 9-6 suited or something like that. I can get super paid off the times I hit with it. I didn't really realize how bad it was. I kind of always had like the intuition of it, but when Doug created Flop Falcon, and I started plugging in like, okay, if I'm going to set mine wider in this situation, and my opponent has X range, how often is it going to be that overlap that we're looking for, right? Because it's in order for you to get paid off, either your opponent has to be like the spewiest dude in the world, where it's just like they're gonna three barrel everything, they're gonna overbet rivers with nothing, like tons of the time, so you're getting all of that extra money, or it's that they're hitting strong enough to pay you off. And it was fascinating when you start looking at things like, okay, how often do I flop a set and they flop strong enough to pay me off? It's not great, like at all. It's so much more rare than you think it is. And even more so when you have something like, say, a 9-6 suited, because you're like, oh, well, I can catch my flush and get paid off, or catch a sneaky straight. Okay, no problem. Or maybe I catch two pair and get paid off. That's where you really got to put a pause in it, though. Because if you're flopping two pair and you think your opponent's calling with all these extra stupid, silly hands pre-flop, it's that much easier for them to catch a slightly better two pair than yours. And it's always going to be with like, Jack 6 when the board's 9-6X and then Jack on the turn. You're like, how am I getting crushed here?
Right. And then
For the exact reason why you called pre-flop.
we see people like playing their overly weak hands. Like, a lot of times you have to play your bottom two pair kind of cagey, and you don't really get to put in like raises with it necessarily.
Right.
And now, like, but are you extracting enough then if they're just like really wide? And then like how do you handle the wider range on the flop, right? Because now it actually increases the possibilities in their hands, and you have to account for a lot of air. It's a complicated scenario. And honestly, one of the ways that you can handle this scenario is just by playing your standard strong range, right? That's what naturally exploits a wide spewy player, is just like you're just always aggressive. No matter what, even though they're spewy, you're still going to play your, hands aggressively, and you're still always tight. So it's like you don't have weak hands like they do, and they're just going to have to deal with that. It's been such a common theme for me when I'm testing at 100 no limit, or I even tested some 50 no limit, and it was like, okay, I'm just going to be following my standard 4-bet frequency here, and I'm like, if 50 no limit, I'm like, man, I'm really not getting 3-bet that much. Should I 4-bet my bluff here? And then I just do it anyways, and it works. And it's one of those things that people don't understand, is that like they get so afraid of like losing in the individual hand that they don't realize that their entire strategy protects them, And so it's like, even if I'm playing at 15 limit and people are not, 3-betting that aggressively, we don't expect that type of tendency, you can still make your standard 4-bets, and it's okay. Like, it's part of your strategy. You know, you're over realizing somewhere else within your strategy if you're not getting pushed off of, hands and things like that. And, say they're like overcalling or something versus the four bet, or like over shoving, or their three bet range is so tight and me four betting against them is spewing. Well, then all my open raises are more profitable because they're not getting pushed off. So it's, you don't have to have an exploitative line for every scenario. You don't have, like, I think that's what really tricks people, is that they always want to be ahead of their opponent. I'm really good at poker. Like, there's most situations I don't have a direct line into a fault in my opponent's play because, well, even for me, I play on no HUD sites a lot. So it's like, you just, I think a lot of times people tend to get overly reliant on, like, well, I have these two, pre-flop, call stat and pre-flop raise stat, and I should be able to figure out everything about my opponents. It's like not the case. People do random things, and relying on your baseline strategy is a totally valid option, especially in the earlier scenarios and pre-flop where it's like we pretty much know how you should handle most scenarios.
And that's kind of what I was thinking is preflop is, it's funny, it's one of the areas where I probably have the least amount of like exploitative focus in my game.
Yes.
Whereas if you talk to someone who's a little bit newer, who's really starting to get more interested in strategy, that's where they're putting so much of their exploitative focus. And it's just like, make preflop more automatic for yourself. I mean, that's why we're doing the solve runs that we are and creating the charts from all those, is because just have preflop be an automatic part of your game. Focus your exploitative stuff postflop. That's where I find things to be way more profitable, way easier, and sure, you get more preflop data just because, preflop happens every single hand, not necessarily always postflop, but you can get a pretty good feel for the kind of mistakes that people are going to make postflop if you're paying attention. Even if you're not using a HUD, if you're playing live, there's tons of information out there. I mean, live, just listening will get you tons of information, but just, do people feel comfortable giving action with like top pair meh kicker? Because if they don't feel comfortable with that, they're not going to feel comfortable with pretty much anything other than a draw and things that are obviously stronger than top pair meh kicker. And as such, they're probably overfolding, and as such, bombs away. Yep. But trying to figure that out, like for preflop stuff, I just don't find to be as useful. Just like it's energy draining, whereas all that energy could be focused post-flop, especially on turns and rivers. That's where I find the real bread and butter to be for my exploitative focus.
Yeah, I think most new players just don't have the level of data and tools and experience to exploit people pre-flop. Like, it's a complicated situation because you have to, deal with those scenarios. Like, people are assuming because we're flat calling, uh, we're not thinking about like, the three bet cold calls we would have gotten. Like, those are important data points, and they're all just handled by using a GTO frequency. So I completely agree. Post-flop is an amazing place to focus. In fact, if you want help with that, we have an incredible course by Weasel where he talks about exactly that. What he's analyzed, millions and millions of hands and databases, and he's come up with textures and scenarios that you can take advantage of, basically on every street post-flop, and how to basically navigate that, understand where the player tendencies are. And I think that is where I go for my exploitative approaches. Is I want to have large data sets. I want to have absolute clarity and kind of know exactly what I'm doing. Then I can make a small tweak and adjustment on, okay, well, this is a force rate board, but I know my like a wider range pre-flop. Therefore, there's maybe more force rate in their range, and I can kind of balance it out. But I have that nice baseline starting point. Same way I go with GTO, and I can build upon that. And rather than saying like, oh, well, I know my opponents are doing this, therefore I'll do that, and not having that data set. I mean, the data set, I think, is really, people have to understand that like exploitative play is based in data. It's not actually based in like knowing what's going on. Even when you're like looking at your player pool and you maybe understand how they're doing that, you're able to understand that because you've seen enough scenarios over time that like, oh, I know that they'll lean tightly with this type of situation. And, like live players, we know when the big bets go in, pretty much, most small stakes players get uncomfortable. Like, they don't like stacking off light. They're going to have nutted hands, etc. That just tends to be the way it goes. That's a large data piece of data that you can build a population analysis around. But for example, you get to the river and they have ace queen on an ace high board, and you're trying to figure out how much that they might fold it. It's just like you don't freaking know. Like there's no way you have enough data to know even probably like the average player at that limit, like, or what they think of you, because that's a huge variable that people don't account for. Is that like if you're playing our recommended style, you're going to be the most aggressive player in a small stakes game, generally speaking. Certainly a live small stakes game for the most part, and you're not going to know how they're going to react to you because they most certainly think differently about you than they do like sort of the average player. And yeah, you really have to make sure you're trying to rely on reliable data. You're using good fundamental analysis that analyzes the situation correctly based on all the variables that you have. And you're really not just making a play that you kind of like want to make that'll make you feel better or reduce risk or something like that. That's not in our EV equation.
Fair. And there is one other part to, I think, the exploitative conversation that I think we've touched on too much, but it's really the technical part of your game has to be very strong to do this properly, which means you have to understand the math behind different bet sizes and frequencies in terms of how often things are actually going to happen. Are you going to be able to find enough good double barrel opportunities based upon how often the turn card is going to be favorable for, this exploitative barrel that you're trying to set up right this moment? And if you don't understand your break even points on different bet sizes, different raise sizes, then a lot of this discussion is for naught.
Yeah,
Because
very
you
good
might
point.
identify a spot where a bet is profitable, but which bets? Like which sizes of those bets? And if you have no idea, then like the conversation is moot. So if you're even slightly interested in the exploitative, you have to also understand the math and the technical part of this. And
Yeah.
it's not that difficult. I mean, a little bit of exploration. My workbooks are good for this. It's like a large chunk of the reason why I developed them is because people needed to do this kind of exploration, but it was too boring just to do with flashcards. So, okay, workbook tends to solve that issue for people, but if you're not putting some time and effort with it, yet alone spending some time and effort with things like Flopzilla, then you're straight guessing. And straight guessing is just a recipe for making some pretty gnarly mistakes.
Yeah.
And again, oftentimes just justifications for bad play. And the newer you are, the less you're going to know. You're not going to have a good data set. So relying more on the GTO approach makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
But if you have information on your player pool, if you have the technical wherewithal, then I think at least looking for spots where you can deviate from GTO, get more exploitative because you can punch up your EV there, makes a tremendous amount of sense. But again, it's mostly a post-flop thing, not nearly as much of a pre-flop thing as most people think it is.
And I would just wrap up saying that, you know, even if you feel like you do need to lean with, some exploitative analysis, make sure you're not under accounting for your opponents being able to bluff or tilting or spewing or doing something random. All those things happen in poker and they happen regularly. And just because you feel like they might lean in a certain direction, don't go too far. Actually, in fact, a lot of the way I get to the GTO lines that I come up with is I just basically give my opponents credit for being able to make some of these plays at least a percentage of the time. And by doing so, you naturally come up with a more balanced strategy. There are, of course, situations where things get very specific and you can really nail someone's range. But that's a pretty advanced thing. So make sure that you can practice getting there. I know you've talked a lot about hand reading. You have a hand reading course that goes over things like that. But yeah, it's just it's never a problem to underassume that you can get the advantage against your opponent and give them credit for things, and then just balance your strategy, knowing that they could play okay at least. And yeah, that's always where I start, and I find I'm more often in the right place, I think, than the average player because I make that account for people being able to make some capable plays.
I think that can be a little bit safer. And if nothing else, it keeps you away from making a bunch of ego-oriented plays where you think you can get away with everything. Because
Yeah.
once you get a little taste of that, it's pretty easy to start overdosing pretty quickly.
And just remember, like the big mistakes everyone makes, everyone thinks they can call more than they can. Everyone thinks that they don't need to be as aggressive as they need to be. Those are the two things that, like, if your exploits are falling in that camp, like, be really careful. Be really careful. Be absolutely certain. Figure out exactly what your assumptions are. And chances are they're probably wrong. You're supposed to be playing tight and you're supposed to be playing aggressive. And that's just how, no limit hold'em poker cash games work.
Totally fair. I'm good here. How about you? Any last thoughts?
No, I think we covered it.
I think we did too. This was good. I really appreciate you hanging out today, Chris. Chit chat about exploitative poker. If you have any thoughts or questions as the listener, and you're like, I wish they would have touched on this, or kind of still got a follow up thing, or I think I exploited right. Don't hesitate to catch us on the Discord, redchippoker.com/Discord. Post a hand, post a question, and we would love to hear from you and chit chat with you and help you look at GTO and exploitative play in today's games. So if you need anything at all, don't hesitate to let us know. Otherwise, we'll see you back next week with a brand new episode. In the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.